But that is what we really try and get past initially is people not wanting to ask the questions about it, because it's a very new technology, right? It's important to understand that they're understanding what I'm showing them, and that it's not getting mixed up in their preconceived notions of things.
Welcome to the Trend Detection Podcast, powered by Siemens. And now your host, Niall Sullivan.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Trend Detection Podcast. I'm really pleased to welcome back Jordan, another one of our regular guests on here. So, hi, Jordan. Thank you for joining us. And today, we got we were just talking about this before. It's a slightly different topic to normal. I mean, I'm sure it will cover a lot of the themes that we normally cover, but with a slightly different angle. We're talking about creative thinking in predictive maintenance. And there's often, conversations I have, it's very engineering, it can be technical, but today we're sort of looking at it from a completely different angle. So I'm really pleased you've joined us for this. Jordan,
happy to be here.
Yeah, and just to give your insights, your career journey, and and with Siemens today as well. So let's get us started. So let's talk about your career journey, I guess, to start with, and how creativity sort of played a role in that up to now.
Yeah, great. Yeah, well, I mean, I think creativity is very important, right? It's sometimes a bit of a weird topic to talk about in terms of engineering, because it's quite a logical, technical kind of role. But I think the creativity within these fields is really what helps you innovate, and really what helps you develop these new solutions to maybe some older problems that can sometimes feel established, right? Like the solution feels established, but there are better ways to go about it. It's just, if we don't have that creativity to try and tackle these problems in new ways, then we don't really innovate on what we've had. And, that's one of the reasons why I like working with Senseye so much, is it's a very innovative way to approach these predictive maintenance problems.
And I guess we could look at creativity from both sides of the coin, from like a vendor perspective, so from our perspective, but also the customer side. How do those sort of two sides come together in a creative way to come up with creative solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're referring to like in a collaboration, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's principally what we do during a Senseye deployment, right? It's a very key part of the delivery process. We need that collaboration in creativity from ourselves and through the customers, right? Because it's a conversation at the end of the day. A lot of this deployment, there's no out of the box solution, and I think that's really what sets us apart from any competitors, is that we don't just have a model and we say, okay, there you go, there's the model. Start recording things based on this model. It's everything is bespoke and custom for that customer, which means that there's that feedback loop between both us and the customer and the app. It's all integrated into the process. And because of that, there's a lot of creativity that needs to go into those solutions. Just because, there's the same, say, type of asset with two different customers doesn't mean that asset requires the same solution in both instances. Sometimes we might have constraints on that. There might be some technical differences, and that's what we really try and take into account here. So that's one of the key areas that we need to have that collaboration to come up with some kind of solution specific to this specific issue.
And I know we have sort of a methodology for deployment as well, through the Senseye Knowledge platform, and there's a step-by-step approach. But I mean, maybe you could share an example of like where something outside of that, because obviously I'm guessing a deployment doesn't always work so in a linear fashion like that.
Yeah.
I would, to say the least. But maybe you could share an example of like a completely unconventional idea during the deployment where wow, that completely changed things, or where it was maybe a bit stuck and got you out of that.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a few instances when things like this can crop up, right? And I think I've probably got a pretty good example of where we can kind of show this off. Is sometimes you'll have a problem, and the customer is really interested in applying Senseye to try and solve that problem. So we had one with electric car chargers, for example, and within that problem, the customer was very excited to push forward with that, although they weren't quite data ready with the information and the data points and the way they stored their data to really fully take advantage of a PDM solution. Now, because of that, we tried to operate with the data that was available and that was configured well. and it gives some insight, but it doesn't really take into account and really hit those key, like the key failure modes that they were experiencing, right? So we had to think outside the box a bit and have a bit of creativity around that solution. And we were thinking, okay, so with what we have, how can we take what we have, manipulate it in some kind of way to be able to really tackle this problem without having to, install new sensors, completely redo how the charger works, because, with these chargers, they're very fixed. They do have a fixed design. There's not too much space for additional creativity within those designs because they're already on, deployed in remote places. So what we ended up doing in the end was to work out if there's some kind of failure with the chargers. We could actually determine what was going on with the charger pins by monitoring the temperature in both of those pins, which was being stored within the chargers, but we needed an update to access them. So we could get the temperature from both of the pins within the chargers, and that's fine. But that again doesn't really tell us too much. But we can utilize one of the features of the application, which is derived measures, and that lets us determine what the difference in the temperature is over a period of time within those two pins for each one of the chargers and each side of the charger. And from that, you can actually determine what the degradation is within the charger itself. And that was a really key indicator for us, which, typically we wouldn't go for something like that. We'd have, some more robust sensors to really, focus in on whichever issue. But in this case, it just wasn't possible to deploy that in this instance, just because of how remote the chargers were, and it was already established. So for a good win for us, we went down the route of looking at those temperature differences, and that gave us some really good insight.
I guess with that example of derived measures, it's almost like you're using features in a different way. So there might be a set way, or if you go to our help center, it will say this is how you use or deploy derived measures. But what you're saying is you sort of had to adapt it to the particular customer's use case.
Yeah, precisely. There's some, there's that kind of engineering approach of like, there's a very procedural way of doing this, and you can use derived measures in that way. That's typically for things like, off states or regimes, or, and what I mean by regimes is like a different operating procedures. So maybe like different temperatures, things like that, and a way to segment those. But you can also use them in more inventive and creative ways where we're manipulating the data in some kind of capacity that you typically wouldn't expect. And that's when it really gets, specific for a particular customer, because you really need to understand their data and the application of that data.
I guess one aspect of creativity is, is sort of the way you explain things. Well, I guess in a marketing speak, it's more like storytelling. Like, how do you explain something where you've got, you know the issue, and you've got a potential feature that can help with that issue, but you have to use it in a different way. So there's a way of saying it that the product can't do this, but it can do this. I don't. Do you see what I mean? It must be.
Yeah. It's kind of like I guess that's another good thing about Senseye, right? Is it's got almost like a bit of a free form to it in certain ways. There's some very regimented aspects of it where there's particular information that needs to be entered, and that's the nature of engineering sometimes, right? But there's also other aspects of it, like derived measures, where you need to have that creativity and understand what you're working with and understand the problem you're trying to tackle, so that you can put both of those together and try and develop something that isn't just out the box, put that into the application, there you go, that's the solution. It's something that you've got to work with the data a bit, do a bit of manipulation, and kind of see how you can explore that in a different way. And the storytelling that you mentioned, I think that's quite an interesting one, right? Because I think sometimes, again, this is the dichotomy with this kind of work, right? You've got the very kind of technical side, and you've got the creative side of trying to deploy these things in industrial situation. And I think within the storytelling of that, you can kind of see when you have these deployments, you can go by go by the book, say, and have the implementation exactly, flat out, based on the technical requirements. But then there's also that conversation that needs to be had, and it's part of a conversation, part of a storytelling, where you can explain how a lot of these features can be utilized in a more creative way. But you also have that cycle of feedback with the customer, right? So you might ask them something and they might not exactly want to share what's going on because, they don't want to say, oh, we're doing this wrong, or we're struggling with this, or we're struggling with that. But by telling them how you've experienced this before, they can be like, oh, well, that's actually quite interesting. That is a creative way to approach that. And so they'd be more open of saying like, okay, well, we do actually have this problem. Is there any way that, your derived measures could be applied to solve that? And you go, oh, well, actually, if you have X, Y, and Z, we can work with it like that.
Yeah, and I remember actually probably the last time we recorded actually in the Manchester studio, you provided that example there of like of a customer being almost shy or about saying that the app's not quite done what it's what it's supposed to or whatever. But you're like, well, no, we need this feedback, right? It's all good saying the app's brilliant and it does fantastic things which we want to hear, but we know that's not always the case with any technology or any software, right?
Oh, well, exactly. I feel like if you think your technology is already the best, that's when you stagnate, right? And there's no improvement on that. There's always room to improve, and the customers are really key to working out where it needs to the improvement needs to focus.
I guess another way to think about it as well, because we've probably talked about it. We certainly talked about in the podcast about stakeholder management, and we know. We talk to many different stakeholders with different priorities across the business. But again, if we talk about this sort of creativity across different teams, commercial teams or technical teams, how have you approached that in the past, Jordan? Or what have been your observations, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, across different teams, it's kind of tricky. I mean, I don't want to throw anyone into the fire pit and say people aren't creative, right? But some teams are definitely more akin to it than others. I think it really depends on the kind of the environment that they're fostered in, that wherever they're doing this kind of deployment, and sometimes also that comes with the industry, right? Like some industries, there's less room for that. Like say if you're working in pharmaceuticals, it's very important that you're basically doing things as they need to be done, and your space for having any creativity within that process is usually pretty low. So when you come and you do something like predictive maintenance, where it might be required to some extent, maybe you're not really prepared to make any kind of leaps, and you're like, okay, we need to have it exactly like this, because otherwise, we ruin a batch, which is, worth hundreds of thousands,
Yeah, and I think you perfectly articulated why it's never a one size fits all. I think even within one industry, right? So different organizations have different mindsets, different approaches, different cultures. But that's a really good example of, like you said, in a certain industry where, you have to work in a certain way, whether it's regulatory requirements, etc. Doesn't mean they're not creative. It just means a lot of their work naturally has to, if you need to meet regulations, it has to focus a lot.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes that's where it comes in at the start of the journey with Senseye. They might be a bit more rigid about it and be thinking, okay, well, no, this is exactly how it needs to be. And it's not until you have those conversations, you say like, oh, we've seen this, we've seen that, perhaps we could approach it in this way, that they start to think as well, like, oh, okay, so we can still have meet the specs, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in this specific way. We can still do that with what we have, or manipulating a few of the data points that we do have, which is still explaining what's going on, but it just needs to be looked at from a different perspective, right?
Yeah, I think the way I'd look at it is, even if we say an industry or an organisation is less creative, but they're still contributing to, say, your creative thinking, because they're obviously domain experts, the organisational expert, maybe, and they know their machines maybe better than others and how it should work and that kind of thing. So in a way, they contribute, even if you're the one maybe coming up with solutions sometimes, they're still a crucial input into it. Without their input, there is no creativity, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, they're the experts in their process, right? Like we have a lot of knowledge across a lot of different domains, but it is even in a domain that you're very knowledgeable about, the customer is always going to know more about that particular thing because they work with it every single day, right? And we work across different verticals.
I wanted to sort of shift gears a little bit, because I know, again, another podcast, well, one of my favourite podcasts we did actually was talking about connected curriculum and actually bringing Senseye to students at Manchester MMU, I'm just going to say, in the north of England. But and it was a fantastic podcast. I might even link to it in the show notes because it's a fascinating conversation. But
Yeah, it was great.
it's another form of collaboration, right? And I'd love for you to sort of talk about the collaboration between Steve, who sort of runs it from the Siemens side, Ari, sorry, who's the lecturer, and with the students themselves. I know it's a lot to unpack, but maybe we could start with the student engagement first of all.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's definitely a lot of aspects of the student engagement generally, right, which I think is very important. I think probably the first thing to say is it's a very interesting project to get to work on in a collaboration, right? Because typically Senseye is fully geared towards industrial applications, and so there's a lot of underlying assumptions that we make when we design things for the application, when we go through our deployment process. Generally everything around the application is geared towards industry and how people in industry operate. And so because of that, when you come to apply, some kind of application demo to an educational setting, it's very different. And it's only then that you kind of really start to clock all of the underlying industrial assumptions that we make. For example, that people are going to be working with it every day, which in industry they do because they're always working with the machines every day. The students, they might have other classes, right? They might have other topics that they need to go to. They're not just on Senseye the entire time, or they're not logging on to Senseye every day. So how do we change how the application works in a way? How do we change how we run it so that it is applicable to students in a way that they can understand what's going on and still build up a story so they can see it from, okay, I might be doing this in a classroom, but this is how it might look in industry. And that's quite a tricky challenge.
No, and I completely get that. It's like, it's a completely different way of thinking and creative. So, of course, you have to think creatively. But what was sort of the process of adapting how you would, show the value of Senseye to customers versus students? Right? How do you sort of adapt your process in a creative way? Let's say.
Yeah, certainly very tricky, but that is, it does require a lot of creativity in that regard, right? You go with the customer, they have data. It might not necessarily be good data, but they have data, and it's constant. From the students, they don't have data. They're not working with a live machine necessarily, although there is scope for us to potentially do that with one of the live machines. Which, if we speak to Steve again, you might hear more about that because he's working on that at the moment. But without derailing myself, the students don't at the moment have a machine with live data that they're working with. So for starters, before we can even begin with it, they need some form of data, right? So what I've done, because I've worked with lots of different industries with different problems that arise, and I've seen the data, I've seen what that kind of looks like. So I know generally what some of the issues may represent themselves as, and in the data. So let's keep it really simple. You might see some clear spikes in the data. You might see some trends across time that are very gradual. You might see the spikes that happen immediately and come back down, but you need to catch those. And you might even see some data that needs to be manipulated. So, for example, a really key one, and taking this back to what I said before with the derived measures and the off states, is you might get data points where you're recording all the on states, but also all the off states. And what I wanted to represent to the students is you don't always have perfect data, right? It's not always just noise free, straight line, and it does this. It's potentially going to be noisy. It's potentially going to be there might be stop starts. There potentially might be all those off states in it. And so one of the good examples I gave them so they could engage with those derived measures was where they have off states every other data point, which means that if you look at the data just from, say, an hourly point of view, it looks fine, right? Because the application will take all of those off states, which are zeros, combine them with the actual value, and you'll get an average. But it means that average is a magnitude of 0.5 less than what the actual data is, which means that the changes you see in the data is going to be reflected as half as much as they would be in the real data, which potentially is going to miss detections unless you remove those. So an exercise for the students, and we let them onto this if they don't catch it when they first look through the data, is you need to remove those off states, otherwise you're not going to get the detections. And that builds up more and more as the idea is more students use the same data pool over time. Then the new students will get to build on the information submitted by the previous students. in terms of Copilot and the detections that are being pulled out. So you're building that story across, multiple sets of students, and it means the demo is getting better each time, even if they are doing the same kind of data manipulations.
Yeah, and it's funny you're putting that out straight away that data won't be perfect. So they don't come out into big wide world. Maybe work for Siemens. Start start with those misconceptions that the data
Yeah.
will be perfectly clean and ready to go. Because I'm sure you could attest to the fact that's not always the case.
Yeah, it never is. I'd be more surprised. I'd be worried if I saw that it was completely clean. I'd be thinking, okay, something wrong's happening here.
See, that's where the creativity really comes in. Then it's finding the nuggets and the needles in haystacks to amongst all the noise, maybe.
Exactly.
Now, I guess we go down that line actually of like misconceptions. So that's obviously from a student perspective, and we could talk from that. Maybe that's a good way to place it because you obviously talk to a lot of industrial clients who no doubt have misconceptions about predictive maintenance, but the student side as well. Completely new to the topic and learning about AI and stuff. So maybe let's start with the student as we're continuing that. So is there, when Senseye's first introduced them, is there certain things they presume about the product or how it might work?
Well, I would say, first of all, with the students, it's usually quite tricky because since it's new to them, they don't want to say, I don't know what this is. So it can be a bit tricky sometimes to actually hear what those misconceptions are, right? But that is what we really try and get past initially is people not wanting to ask the questions about it because it's a very new technology, right? It's important to understand that they're understanding what I'm showing them and that it's not getting mixed up in their preconceived notions of things. Especially, I can say this about the students, but this happens in industry as well, is students will learn about, say, machine learning principles or AI models, and they'll look at things and they'll say like, okay, well, what's the training method on this? Is it like supervised learning or whatever? And they'll use these words to try and apply it to what they've already seen before, maybe like textbooks or, in the case of industry, what they've read. And that's a good thing to do, right? Like I'm happy that people understand what's going on. But specifically with Senseye, this is where the difference comes in, right? Is when we create these models, and this is the big misconception really, when we create these models, it's all done specifically on that data set. And usually with AI, it's a big data problem. You throw all the data at it and you say, okay, there's everything. Tell me what the difference is now. But when you do things like that, you lose the nuance. And so what we do instead is we take those condition indicators, which is a very specific, say, piece of data or data sets that align with the specific failure modes that we want to observe. And it's boiled down. We cut out all of the bad data, all the noise, all the off states, things like that. So it's as close to being clean as possible before we give it to the AI. Because then if it's being trained on clean data, the correct data and specific data, then it's going to be able to give you very specific and very good results when it starts figuring out where the deviations are, where the degradations are. If we just throw everything at it, then it's going to take into account noise. It might struggle a little bit with it. It's going to take into account those off states. It might be thinking, okay, that's weird that the baseline's low, but that's all it knows, right? And that's a very key difference between Senseye and, say, other machine learning models. Is it's not a big data problem, but that's something that is very, very common in machine learning, and so that's a big misconception that we see.
And it's interesting as well. It's when I guess going slightly back to the creativity point. I'm sort of thinking that you mentioned it's just because you mentioned textbooks as well, because there's a lot you can learn in textbooks. But as we know, actually doing stuff and practical stuff is where you really learn. And I guess that's where creativity sort of comes out as well, right? When you actually got your hands on a product or hands on data and you can see it working and see how it all works together. That sort of inspires creativity, right?
Oh, exactly. Well, it has to, right? Because it's not just a standard set of procedure that you follow to get to the solution, right? All the data is going to be different, and it might be, say, a standardized end goal, if you want to call it that, of getting the data to the point where it's clean. But then, what do you define as clean in this case? Maybe the data is fine when you receive it. Maybe it's really noisy, and that's really bad. Maybe it's very noisy, but the magnitude's so low it doesn't really matter. And these are the decisions you've got to make, which it is the creativity in the solution, right? Because different people are going to approach that in different ways, but at the end of the day, there's not necessarily a right answer towards cleaning it, as long as we have it in a way that the AI can understand. And I think that's probably something that that AI is quite good at, right? Is this more free flow way of working. You don't need to have it, in a rigid, necessary way, but you're working towards a rough kind of end goal, and then that the AI will assist you with getting it over the finish line, so to speak.
Exactly, and that's a nice way to. Again, we haven't really touched on buzzword AI, and how that features it, in terms of creativity. I guess both in your role, Jordan, and and what you see in your deployments of Senseye as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing. I think AI is a very good tool for the being creative in your work. It's just because of the nature of it, right? It's almost like having I don't want to go too sci-fi, but it's like having a little brain there that's learning itself. And when you're learning things, there is a need to be creative. You can give things rigid rules, but then it's really not going to think outside the box much, right? So that's why it's important when we're engaging with AI that we do have a bit of creativity with it. We don't just close all the doors on what we're operating with, because it needs to be able to see the bigger picture, really, and that's where it really shines, is being able to see the bigger picture and not just one or two things. We can provide it with these parameters and we can try and push it towards looking at certain failure modes, for example. But as you engage with it, you can start to see maybe where its holes in its knowledge are based on the data you've given it, and think, okay, well, where do we fill that in? And it really is just like teaching, say, like an intern, about your system. And you think like, okay, it doesn't know much going into it because it's new, But if you tell it the context, if you tell it the data, and I mean that's something I haven't touched on, to be fair, but it's something that's quite important. It's the context around the data as well. That adds a whole nother dimension to it. But I'd be talking here all day if I get into that.
Mm-hmm. The way I say, it's an enabler for creativity, right? I mean, if people,
100%.
I mean, I could even talk in the marketing context. If you just simply replace, the creative functions of marketing with AI, it's not going to work, but it can help. It's a nice sounding board. It can make some processes certainly a lot smoother and things like that. So that's how I'd position it myself as a marketer. It's an enabler. It's not necessarily there to replace. I know it's an often thing we talk about, right, in the context of within an industrial, on a plant or whatever. It's not there to replace. It's there to support.
Well, I think that's a good way of putting it, to be fair, right? Is like, yeah, it enables you to work with a lot of these issues, but you need to be there to help it along the way, right? Like it doesn't know everything. It's not just going to be ahead of marketing or ahead of engineering, because then you give it something new and it's going to be like, whoa, like what's going on here? It can't really think for itself in that way. But when you've got people that know what they're talking about, curating what is fed to that AI, then it can be really beneficial, because it can take in a pool of knowledge, say, and help that collaboration too.
Absolutely. So I see we're coming to end of time. Not all time, just this podcast. But I realise what I'm saying. But I'd just like to sort of finish and sort of round things up, I guess. So, and really, it's about young engineers, and we've talked a lot about the connected curriculum side, which I think is a fantastic thing. But what advice would you give to people coming into the industry about bringing more creativity into the role, and not just seeing it as just as a engineering technical role, which is great, but how can they bring creativity into it from your position?
Okay, I think that's a great question. For me, there's a lot of ways that you can bring creativity into this kind of domain, and there's a lot of things that new engineers are going to need to know when they're starting out, right? But for me, I think if there was one key takeaway, I would say you've got to ask those questions, right? A lot of new engineers, you see this a lot with the students, are a bit scared to ask the questions because they don't want to look like they don't know what they're talking about. AI and what we do with predictive maintenance is a very, very new field. Not everybody knows the answer. Not everybody knows the solution. And even the people that do know the solutions, if you ask questions, you might spark some new solution. That's how you get the creativity, is by asking the questions. You might not understand things as well, or maybe you do. Maybe you do understand them well, but you don't realize how well you understand them. You ask a question, and the engineer who's been there for years is like, oh, that's a good point, actually. Maybe we can go down this route. And you can explore that new avenue, which might actually result in a better way of monitoring those machines, might give you a better solution to the problem. And at the end of the day, even if it doesn't, right, at least as a new engineer, you now have more information for the next time you approach a problem. So it helps your growth, and it also helps, develop this sector, which I think is really, really important. And just having the confidence to ask those questions, I think, is super, super important.
Wow. Yeah, that's a very visionary statement at the end. I like that. And it rounds off our podcast very much. So, yeah, so it's not just about the individual and their creativity. It's, it's about how it can influence, and push through to, others in the sector as well. I really like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Finishing statement. But no, thank you so much for joining us today, Jordan. And we'll certainly invite you back on soon if you're willing.
I'd love to.
It's been fantastic. But yeah, thank you. And thank you to everyone for listening, wherever you are. And we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please like and subscribe on all major podcast channels, and find out more about Senseye Predictive Maintenance at Siemens.com.